Welcome to the Aspen Institute's Hurst Lecture Series program entitled The Gifts of Adversity, featuring Marissa Molina in conversation with Domenika Lynch. I'm Crystal Logan, Vice President of Aspen Community Programs and Engagement at the Aspen Institute. And I first want to thank Bob and Soledad Hurst for their support of this program. Thanks to our audience for tuning in for this important conversation. As I introduce our guests, you'll find links to their full bios in the chat. And if you have questions for our guests, feel free to type those into the Q&A feature at any time during the event. Marissa Molina is the Colorado State Immigration Director with Forward.us, where she leads Forward's legislative advocacy efforts on immigration policy at the state and federal level. In 2015, she was honored by the White House as a champion of change. She was appointed to the Metro State University of Denver's Board of Trustees by Governor Polis in 2019, becoming the first Dreamer to serve on a state board. Domenika Lynch is moderating today. She's the Executive Director of the Aspen Institute's Latinos in Society program. Prior to joining us last year, she served as President and CEO of the Congressional Hispanic Caucus Institute, the preeminent Latino Leadership Institute founded by Hispanic members of Congress in Washington, D.C. We are thrilled and honored to host you both here today. And with that, I'll turn it over to you, Domenika. Thank you.
Thank you, Crystal, and thank you so much for hosting us here with the Hurst Lecture Series. Welcome, everyone. It is indeed my honor to be with you this afternoon to have a conversation about the gifts of adversity. We know that with COVID-19, many of us have experienced all kinds of hardships, whether that's trauma with the big T or with the little t, but nonetheless, if we have life, you have opportunity, an opportunity to make things better than they were before. Our special guest today, Marissa Molina, is that kind of person that no matter what's in front of her, her optimism and her belief in the power of the goodness of people and the possibility of a better tomorrow is what guides her life. She is an extraordinary emerging leader from Glenwood Springs, Colorado, and I'm just so delighted to have this conversation with you. So Marissa, let's just jump right in. So thank you, first of all, for being with us today.
Yeah, it's an honor. I'm so excited to be here.
Great. So take us back to a moment in time in Mexico when you were a child, and it was that moment that your family decided to take the journey to the United States. What was happening and why Colorado?
Yeah, I was 9 years old when I came to Colorado, and I've lived here for 20 years. So Colorado is also home now, but there was a time when I was living in a very small town in Chihuahua, Mexico. And, you know, my dad was somebody who had to leave school when he was in 7th grade. He had to step out of school to be able to support his family. And so for him, his biggest dream was that his kids were going to be able to have the kind of opportunity and access to education that he just never got a chance to. And my mom's similar, you know, my mom was somebody who had always thought about the empowerment of women. And having 2 daughters, she really wanted her daughters to have options in life, to be able to be self-sustaining and to be able to blaze their own trails, regardless of where they were living. And so for both my mom and my dad, education was this really critical piece of giving us the life that they had imagined for us. And unfortunately, you know, growing up in, like I said, a super small, probably village in Mexico, they just didn't feel like they could give us that kind of life. And I had cousins and family who lived in the United States, and my dad would see how they were blossoming and how many access to opportunities they were having. And he's like, I wanted that for you. And even though I was 9 years old, I have this like clear memory of telling my dad, I want to speak English. I want to be like my cousins. And so he always reminds me that I also helped him make that decision to come to the US because I also had this dream. And so really based on that, that's what brought us to the United States, was that search for options, for opportunity, for us to have a choice in life about how we wanted to live it and what we wanted to do with our lives, that my parents just didn't get a chance to. And my dad had family here in Colorado. And so it just, kind of naturally happened that we ended up here. And I remember coming December of 2001 for the very first time, and I had never seen snow in my life, and seeing the big, tall walls of the Glenwood Canyon as we were driving in, and feeling like I was in one sort of a movie set. And lo and behold, I was going to make a whole life here.
And quite the journey you've had, that you could actually start writing your own movie about it as well. So the seeds for the importance of education were planted by your parents, and you had some role models and some of your cousins. So then once you're in the States, then what is that experience for you? And at what moment did you realize that your trajectory was a little bit different than others?
We were so focused when we got here. We knew what the purpose of our journey into this country was. And that was that opportunity. And that was a better education. And so I was so excited when I first got to the US, and, the school had computers. I had never had a computer in my school before. And I remember the first time I ever took a state test. It was at the time called the CSAP. It was like the Colorado State Testing. And I did so well on the exam because I was able to take it in Spanish, that they told my mom, like, well, we can test her into a gifted and talented program. And I remember being taken aside to do this testing. And I remember sitting in front of these tests and looking at them, and just like tears streaming down my face, because I couldn't understand anything that was in the paper in front of me. And so I just felt like this big dream of coming here and having this great education, like somehow I was guilty for not speaking English, for not being at a place where I could test into that program. And I remember being so determined that day to be like, I'm going to learn, and I'm going to learn very fast. And my dad gifted me this little red dictionary, and I would look up every single word, and I would form sentences and bring them to my teacher. And that's how I started to learn to read and write in English pretty fast. And so I, from that moment, became really devoted to my education, to doing the absolute best that I could, and to be able to set myself up for the kind of trajectory my parents came to this country to fight for. And it was really in high school when I started to understand what it meant for me to be both have this dream of college and also be undocumented. And I grew up knowing I was undocumented. My parents were very clear about like what that status meant, and would say to us, like, don't share this with anybody because this could put us in big danger. And I grew up so ashamed of that story. And I grew up so ashamed of who I was because of that, because of this big secret that I carried.
So Marissa, let me ask you, how old were you when they told you that you were undocumented?
When we came, the same year when we came here. So at 9.
You were 9 years old already.
Mm-hmm.
So you're carrying on to high school, and now you're faced with the opportunity of applying for college, and then new realities start to, be revealed to you.
Yeah, and my parents had said, if you work super hard, you can get a full ride scholarship. And that was my goal. I was like, I'm going to work really hard. I'm going to do all the extracurricular activities, and I'm going to be able to get to college because I'll have a full ride scholarship. And I remember seeing my older sister graduate in 2006, this incredibly intelligent and driven person, and have very little options to go to college. And thankfully, she had Colorado Mountain College. At the time, it was just a 2-year program, but she was able to start that. And the reality started to set in of what it meant to be undocumented. And then fast forward to my senior year of high school, I've done cross country, I've done mock trial, I've done all the things, I've kept a nearly perfect GPA. And I was seeing all of these amazing young people who, were right there with me academically, be able to get into these big fancy schools. And I just was like, what's going to happen to me? Where do people like me go? And because I had never shared this status with anyone, no one really knew what my challenges were. And I remember walking into my high school counselor's office and sitting down in front of him. And he said, Marissa, I can't submit your college applications because you're missing your social security number. And I had no choice but to tell him in that moment that I, in fact, didn't have one, that I was undocumented. And I remember he was just like so shocked. It was almost as if somebody like me who had worked so hard and who had done well in school, like we couldn't be undocumented. And I remember he looked at me and he said, I have no idea how to help you, but I'm going to figure it out with you. And he made this really big commitment to me that day to start that journey with me. And he believed in me and he fought for me and he asked all the questions alongside of me. And it was because of him that I was able to get to college. But that was just like the very beginning of what then became a really long and challenging journey to be able to graduate from college.
So here's the power of a teacher. Was it your teacher or your counselor?
My high school counselor.
Yeah. High school counselor who took that extra step to say, I don't know how to get there, but we'll figure it out together. Mm-hmm. And that seems like that's a mantra that you carry for yourself and those that you advocate. So let's fast forward now. You graduate college and you graduate summa cum laude. So that's inspiring in itself. And then what's that trajectory like of becoming a teacher? And then how did that lead you to immigration activist?
When I was in college, right after I got DACA, I was like, I'm going to work. And I got a job as fast as I could in the admissions office. And I started to help parents and students who were prospective students at my college, at Fort Lewis College. And I had a call from a dad in Spanish. And he was like, I don't understand why my son didn't get accepted into your school. I don't really know how to help him. And I asked him, do you know what a GPA is, what an ACT score is? And he had no idea what any of these things were. And so I walked him through that. But in the process, what I started to reflect on was this student in front of me, this dad who I was talking to, wasn't any more different than I was. He had the same dreams that my parents had for me. That student had the same goals that I had. And the thing that made a difference in my life were those people like my college counselor, like the community organizations that gave me scholarships to go to school. I had those institutions and those people that believed deeply in me. And I felt a really big responsibility having had DACA and having had the opportunity to graduate college to say, how do I give back to all those people who have poured into me? And that's when I was like, the best way to give back is to do what they have done for me and do it for other people. I want to be that champion for other young people. And so I had this, life-changing opportunity to teach high school 9th and 10th graders. And they challenged me, but they also changed me as a person. My students were the very first group of people who I was openly undocumented with. I shared with them my story and my struggles. And I'll never forget one of my students, the day after I shared my story with them, she came back to my classroom with a piece of cake. And she said, Miss, I'm so happy that you're my teacher. And I'm so happy that you made it here. And that was the first time I felt like so affirmed in who I was, so loved and so wrapped in support from a community of people. And so I always tell people, my students taught me what it truly means to live in community with others because they showed up for me. And when, there was an article published about me in the Denver Post and there were some negative comments, my students were the first ones to say, how do we fight back against the ignorance of those comments? And so they always showed up. And I tried to show up for them in the same ways they were doing so for me. And in 2016, after the election, the first question my students had was, what's going to happen to you? What's going to happen to my undocumented family? And I couldn't make them a promise that things were going to be okay because I didn't want to lie to them. So what I said to them was like, I don't know, but I'm going to fight every single day to make sure that we are okay, that your family's okay, that I fight for other, even some of my own students who had DACA. And so that's when I really started to connect to this idea of like, what does it mean to do political advocacy and to do so and to be empowered by your own story to do so.
I want to double click on two things because I find them so incredibly inspirational. How the teacher finds the comfort in the students, because as they're validating your experience, you realize too that you're validating theirs. Mm-hmm. And that powerful question of, well, then teacher or miss, how are we going to fight back? So that's been part of your journey, right? And what are you fighting for? Can you dig a little deeper on that? Because as they give you this question, or pose this question, what goes through your mind?
You know, I think a lot about why I went into the classroom. And one of the biggest reasons why I went into the classroom was because I wanted to create the kind of safety that I didn't feel in school, the kind of support that I knew was hard to find for kids that look like me. But I also wanted to go so that my students could see like the responsibility that we have once we make it to the other side, right? That it's not just about uplifting yourself, but that we lift as we rise, right? That every time a door of opportunity is open for you, that you then open a window and pull people in with you. And so for me, it feels really important, even though, you know, my students are now college students, that they can always look back at that person that told them that they have to fight for their communities and they have to look out for one another, and that they see me doing that. Because it is so important for me that as a leader, I carry that kind of integrity. And my students have been such a compass for me in terms of like, where do we go, right? What does it mean to fight? And so for me, it means to fight for them and to fight for one another, to fight in community, to make sure that we are creating pathways of opportunity for more people to grow and to thrive and to be able to build full and successful lives.
So a lot of what you have done is you've had to ground yourself in values. You mentioned integrity, right? And standing for something. What you're standing for is a subject that polarizes our nation, right? In terms of people that are seeking a better life and coming to this country. And then as we're going through a pandemic, and as Americans themselves, citizens here feel that opportunities are scarce for them, then there are two camps fighting, facing fear. How, as someone that is in the work of forming bridges, how do you form bridges in the face of hostility?
You know, I think one of the most important things that I've learned from my own parents has been around like how to love people, how to listen to people. And one of the things my dad always says to us is like, you can always learn something from the people you meet, even if it's just what not to do, right? He's like, there's always something to be learned. And I think for me, it's been important to approach the work from that angle of like, what do I have to learn from somebody who is perhaps against me or against this issue? What is underneath their fear? What is underneath their inability to see me and thousands of other people as humans? Like what stands in the way of us seeing each other? And I think approaching it from that place, right? Approaching it from a place of like, I can't ask you to give me love and respect and grace if I don't give you that back. And so showing up knowing that I'm asking somebody else to see me for who I am beyond that 9-digit number, beyond that status. And that I have to be able to show up in those spaces with that same, with the ability to do the same. And that is hard. That is really hard work at times. But I also think, as somebody recently told me, a civil rights attorney, a Black woman who's been in the work for civil rights for a really long time, she said, that is the work. The work is to talk to people. The work is to change both minds and hearts. And that work isn't easy. And if we're being called into that, then we have to accept that challenge, that sometimes we will be asked to do more than what seems possible.
In this work that you've done, you yourself have felt, have received threats, and you shared some of those with me. walk us through what happens. Maybe you can take a moment if you're
Mhm.
comfortable sharing what kind of threats you've received, and how do you regain composure and move forward?
Yeah, I think one of the hardest things I've ever heard, and maybe not heard but read, right? It was somebody, after an article was published where I shared my story, someone said, well, let me fix the problem by putting a bullet through your head. And I think that notion of like, you don't know me, right? Like you don't know, like, I just want what's best. Like, I'm fighting really hard for this country to be good for me and also for you. And so like that moment felt hard. And I think one of the things that my mom always taught me, and I actually used to have a ring that said this, but it was like, she would say, "Sé auténtica." So be authentic to you. And I'm like, what does it mean to be that? And I think for me, it means to be rooted in who I am. And I think throughout the years where I have found a lot of strength to continue to face the world, despite some of those things that I've been hearing about myself, whether it's illegal or alien, or I'm gonna, put a bullet through your head, has been like, I know the value that I have as a person and as a human being, and nobody can take that away from me. I know who I am, I know what I'm doing, and it doesn't matter what other people say, I will still be Marissa. And so that has been really important for me, to be rooted in that, but also to be rooted in a lot of love for the work that I'm doing, and to be surrounded by that kind of love from people who say, I will be there, I will sit with you when things are hard. And I will say that that is something that I'm really grateful for, something I'm really grateful, particularly of having grown up in the Roaring Fork Valley, have been, despite not knowing for a long time my journey, when people did come to find out my story, I've had so many people reach out in different ways to say, hey, I see you, I support you, I'm here for you. And even though it's a message, like, that has meant the world for me.
Thank you for sharing that, right? And there's something that you have said repeatedly, this mantra. There's a lot of mantras. When we speak, there's a new line that comes, and the one that El mundo es para los valientes. Did I get it right?
Yeah.
That the world is, maybe you can share what it means in English with everybody.
Yeah, it means the world belongs to the courageous. And yeah, I used to cry a lot when I was undocumented in college, and I'd open my computer and I'd have to sit with my mom and show her, this huge balance that we had to somehow find the money to pay because I was paying in-state tuition. And I would start to cry. And I would just tell my dad, well, I'm just going to give up. It's not worth it. And he would sit down and he'd just look me in the eyes and he would say, El mundo es de los valientes. The world belongs to the courageous. And I think for me in my life, it has really meant, like, having courage isn't, not showing that you're afraid, but it is to be afraid and to keep going and to find the way.
Do it anyway. And as we were designing this conversation, we talked about, it's, particularly with the pandemic, it's easy to get lost in everything that is not going well, and then get fearful of what else could be wrong and be preparing for that next thing that could be wrong. And the journey of someone, the uncertainty that comes with being undocumented, is that you just have to flip the script and plan for what can go well. How in this process of being that young person who cried because you were afraid of the responsibility, switching the mindset to be able to know, I don't have to be perfect to be worthy. And that's one of your sayings as well. What was that process? Because there's many people out there that, whatever their circumstance, it's hard to see beyond the difficult moment in front of them. So what did you use to move forward, change the mindset?
I think one of the things that's most important to me in my journey, and has been for a really long time, has been self-reflection. To say, like, where have I been and where am I going? What am I rooted in this moment in time? And what do I want to bring into the next phase of my life? And I think doing that reflection and being able to to identify for myself what were the things and the traits and the values that helped me get here, and how can I bring them into this new stage of life. And I remember, like, you know, just an example, like being terrified of going into the classroom because I didn't go to school to be a teacher. I studied political science and I was going to teach Spanish. And I had never done that before. And I remember being so afraid. And I remember the night before I stepped in front of the classroom for the very first time, I said to myself, I do have the most important thing that I need to be able to stand in front of my students, and that is a love and a commitment to them as people, to grow, to be successful, and most importantly, to find safety in my classroom. That is my main goal. And so when I had really, really hard days, I would ask myself, did I meet that commitment? Did I keep my students safe? Did I love them? Did I give them an opportunity to start fresh because maybe they had a bad day the last day? And if I could answer yes to all of those questions, it didn't matter that maybe my lesson wasn't as perfect as I wanted it to be, but I had done those things. And so I think having the ability to self-reflect and to ground myself in why am I there? Where am I going? Has always helped me break down a really big challenge into smaller chunks that I can kind of, you know, take on in an easier way than to say, I have a whole year to sit in front of these kids. What am I going to accomplish?
Thank you for sharing that, because it is about the mental frameworks that we create for ourselves so we can walk ourselves back from the ledge, you know, and be able, if I sleep on it, tomorrow will be a better day. And every challenge in front of you, it seems like you're able to kind of reflect, and that's one of your superpowers. I want to talk a little bit now about the Latino identity. Latino, Hispanic, Latinx really depends on your immigrant experience. And wanted to ask you, as a Latina, how do you identify, and how does your gender come into play in a culture that has been male dominant?
You know, I think when I think back on, like, when did I start to identify as a Latina, it actually goes back to when I started teaching. Before that, I always used to talk about being Mexican. And a big thing and a big reason why I did that was because I never felt growing up that I could claim this country as mine, even though I had built a whole life. In fact, like, I remember talking and being so careful never to say our country, because I didn't want people to feel like I was taking ownership of a place that maybe didn't belong to me, having been undocumented. And when I started teaching, you know, 56% of the student body in my school was Latinx. I was the only teacher that was Latina in identity. And I had students from Central America, from South America, from Mexico. And I was like, well, I'm in community with my students. And a way to do that is to say, like, we're Latinos, right? I'm bringing in everybody who's in my classroom, and we all belong to this community. And so I actually started to change how I identified myself after teaching, because it felt important to me that it wasn't just about, you know, being Mexican for me. Like, yeah, I'm from Mexico, but when I'm here in the US, my community, the people who maybe look more like me, that's my Latino community. And so I started to identify more as Latina or Latinx as a way to make sure that I was being inclusive of all those other stories in my classroom and in the community where I was teaching. And I continued to identify myself in that way. And, you know, in 2015, when I had this really great privilege to go to the White House and to be recognized as a champion of change, I received this letter from then President Obama. And in that letter, he said, you know, the Champion of Change program is for ordinary people making extraordinary change, right? Like Americans. And that was the first time I had ever been referred to as that. And I remember even in the ceremony, they kept talking to us as like Americans. And I was like, wow, I can claim this country. And I think so much about that letter, and I hold it very dear, not just because it has a fancy signature from President Obama, but because it was that moment when I felt like I belong to this country, not because I have, you know, citizenship. I belong to this country because I am helping build this country. I'm helping build and uplift my community. And that is what it means to have citizenship in a place, is to take that ownership and that responsibility of how you make a place better. And I think that was the first time that I saw myself that way. And I recently was able to adjust my status and went to visit Mexico for the very first time in 20 years. And when I came back into the country and they looked at my green card, and I was, the officer said, "Welcome back." That was like a huge moment for me, because I was like, that's right, I am home here. Like, I am both home in Mexico, but I'm also home here. And so I think how I've understood my identity throughout the time has really been shaped by the different experiences and communities I have been a part of.
Thank you so much for sharing. And that's sort of the cherry on the top of this conversation that only just recently. So congratulations for receiving your residency status. And this was only, how long ago did this just happen?
Just a month ago.
Just a month ago. So you're really taking that in of really embracing America as now your home. And you probably have been already embracing it ever since that letter, but now it's a different document that makes you feel that way. Now, I did want to share with you a little coincidence, I guess, or it's really exciting too, that our CEO, Dan Porterfield, is a champion of change. So you have that in common.
That's amazing.
So it really goes back to the testament of the work that you've done for it to be noticed, and how in the face of adversity, so many positive things have come. So I want to ask you that question. So in this moment in time, what have been the gifts of the adversity that you've encountered from all the things that you've shared today?
One of the things that's been most important is being credible. I have a lot of gratitude because I have just what I consider the most amazing humans around me. And I think that's the biggest gift that adversity has given me, has been the ability to connect and to make long life connections with other people who want to do good, right? Whether it is my students who are forging their own way, right? Or who are the ones who texted me in the election and said, "Miss, I casted my vote for the very first time and I thought about you as I did that." Like, I was so proud. Or, the folks that I met in Durango when I was a college student who constantly send me text messages of love and support, or my college friend who lives in Alaska who writes me letters to say, "I'm so proud of what you're doing. I have your back all the way in Alaska." Or whether it's one of my greatest friends in this world, Marco, who is the reason why I sit on the board of MSU, because he said, "You deserve to be there. You should apply. You should have these conversations." And he's been next to me for so many of the life decisions. And so that's one of the greatest gifts, to just have this incredible community of people, to know at the root, right? And it feels sometimes really hard with what's going on in the world, to say people are good and people show up and people can love you and people can form ways to keep you safe and to keep you loved despite everything else that's going on in the world. So I think that's been an incredible gift, to know and to feel what that kind of connection and what that kind of love is. And I would also say, adversity has given me a really strong root to why I fight. And I think that the fights that I'm having right now, whether it's a policy fight or it's a conversation, they're tough. And there have been a lot of moments when I've sat in spaces where nobody else looks like me, where I'm the youngest person, where nobody else has been undocumented or has had DACA. And I'm like, do I belong here? Am I good enough to sit in this room and tell people and advise people on this issue? And I think adversity has given me the ability to say, I do, and my story and my experiences have value. And this is why they have value. And all the people who I fight for, we have value. And so I think having a really strong why and a really strong sense of who I'm in those rooms for, that gives me the ability to go in there and to speak truth and to be strong when things get hard in those rooms as well.
That's right. It takes a lot of pressure to make a diamond. And that certainly is what's been happening to you. So I am really honored to be able to have this conversation, for you to be so authentic with the good parts, because it's easy to, and the more challenging parts, right? Because there could be people in the audience and say, well, Marissa, you just have some special gifts that I don't. I'm just not as strong as you. What would you say to them?
You know, I would say I'm not any more special. And I say this often to people, right? It's like, the reason why I've done some of the things I've done is because I'm like, I'm not special. I think there's a lot of people out there who have these gifts. And sometimes it has been about like who the right people in a community to support you are, and are you connected to them? And so for me, I would say to people who feel that is, find your people, right? Like, who are the people in your community? Put yourself out there, have conversations with people, and ask for help. I would say that's another really big gift of adversity. You know, I've learned that it is not a weakness to ask for help, but it's actually a way to find strength and to find another human being to love and support you. And so I would say, like, go out there and ask for help. Like, if you want to be something and there's already somebody there, go find them, go ask them, like, how did you get here? Is there a way that I can learn from you? And then I would also say, you know, like, when I used to sit with my parents and cry about tuition or cry about not knowing what the path was for me, my dad would sit down and say to me, okay, well, we're not gonna tackle this huge problem in a day. So what do we have to do tomorrow to get there? And then tomorrow we will ask, what will we have to do the next day to get there? And so sometimes it is taking a really big challenge and breaking it down and getting yourself to that next day. You know, I think there's been a lot of moments when I'm like, I can't keep going. And I remember in 2017, when the Trump administration rescinded DACA, I spent months going to DC, going to talk to members of Congress. And in December of 2017, you know, Congress shut down over the debate around what they were going to do with DACA recipients. And then the shutdown ended and there was no solution. And my DACA had four months left. That's all I had left. And I remember being like, everything I have worked for is going to go away overnight. And I remember calling my parents and saying, like, I'm tired because no matter what I do, I can't change the outcome. I've done everything that I can. And my mom said something to me that I think about really often. And she would say, eres grande aquí y en cualquier esquina del mundo. You are great here and in every corner of the world. And I think it's going back to saying, like, no matter who you are, you have a gift of some sort. No matter who you are, you have value. And I think the most important thing we can do for ourselves is to understand ourselves in such a way that we know what our gifts are and we know what value we bring into a space. Because those are going to be the things that are going to help you carry forward and have the vulnerability to say, hey, I need help. Or, hey, I want to get there and I'm not really sure how. Can you guide me? So I would say, like, those things have felt really important and formative in the ways in which I've been able to tackle both the uncertainty and the hardship that I have faced.
So I know we'll have to wrap up, but I know there's one more important story you shared with me that had to do with facing someone that was against you at a critical moment. And then you were surprised when they voted for you. Mm-hmm. And it had to do with you being part of the trustees. Can you share about that experience? Because it goes back to your superpower of your lived experience and your truth.
Yeah, I had, when I was nominated to sit on the board of MSU, you have to go in front of a committee of senators, the education committee in the Colorado Senate. And there was one Republican senator who I had met in person before, and I knew what his beliefs around immigration were and how he was thinking about immigration. And I knew he was like, we have to do something at the federal level, but I don't think the state should be taking action on immigration issues. And I heard him and I had heard his challenges and I had talked to him several times. And so he's part of this education committee in the Colorado Senate. And I was fearful that I would go in front of him and that he would say, no, why are we creating, yes, DACA recipients need to have a pathway to be able to adjust their status, but at the state level, we shouldn't be creating these exceptions or creating spaces for these folks. And I had this fear. And so I prepared what I was going to share with the committee. And I talked about my students. I talked about my desire to be able to be a voice within that board of trustees that would be representative of our students' interests and our students' experiences. And I sat and I gave that story at times, like in between tears, because it just felt like this incredible moment, right? Here I was, 4 years from when I had graduated college, sitting in front of a group of state legislators, asking them to give me the opportunity to serve in this capacity in the board of MSU Denver. And, I finished, and then they called out the votes. And every single person in that committee voted in support of my nomination. And I remember feeling like really overwhelmed with gratitude. And I stepped outside of the committee room, and that senator came back out and he shook my hand and he said, "Thank you so much for coming. And thank you so much for telling us your story." And that has created and that for me was just like one of the most meaningful experiences that I've had, because there were places and there continue to be places where him and I disagree, at the policy level. But I saw him, right? I sat down with him and I shared my story with him. He listened. He chose to open up and listen. And I think ultimately what we learned by doing that, by creating that opportunity to see each other as people, was that we realized that we both want our state to be a better place. That he cares about education and I do too, that we want to see our students succeed, and not just some of them, but all of them. We want Colorado to be a place that works for everyone who lives here. And we share that commitment, even though sometimes at the policy level, we have those disagreements. And so I think for me, that was really important, because I had just come from all these fights at the federal level where that isn't happening. But at the state level, where we have this really great opportunity to know each other more closely and to see people, more one-on-one because of who they are and what they contribute, like that was an opportunity to be able to do that. And I'm so grateful to him for allowing me the opportunity to share about my story.
And we're grateful to you for allowing us to a little insight into your journey and seeing you for Marissa Molina, a name that we're going to remember and see go many other places, but also for the people you represent, like many other DACA and undocumented families that love this country and contribute to this country. So in sharing your story, you shared your voice, and you're also finding systemic change, right? That's necessary to have an inclusive America. So Marissa, I want to thank you so much for the honor and the time. And I think now we're ready to go back to Crystal.
Thank you.
Thanks to you both. This has been a really, really profound conversation. We do have a couple questions from the audience that have come in. The first question we have is, resiliency is great, and for the Latino, migrant, and/or undocumented community, it is very much a value and reality. But every day, every year, in every space we hold, this is not sustainable or healthy. How do you see us moving beyond the continuous need for resiliency to a joyful, thriving community where we are fully accepted as contributing members of our community and where we can show up as our full selves, especially in our mountain region?
That's a great question. And I would say that, that is something that I've had to really sit with over the last year and a half, because I don't want to sit here and lie to anybody that any of this has been easy. Like I've shared, I've had many moments where I've sat down and wanted to quit. And I think one of the things that I've learned in the past year and a half, particularly after, the really dark, isolated moments of COVID that really tested my ability to stay in this work, was understanding that I have to center my joy and my peace and my well-being as much as I center my fight. that I have to be able to create that space for myself, and that I have to be able to honor for myself that I do deserve to have moments of joy. And, you know, when I spent time in Mexico just 3 weeks ago, I was just there for 4 days, and it was one of the most peaceful times I've had, because I truly felt like I could put down my fight to say, like, I am just going to be with myself and with my people to take this moment in. And so I would say that, like, you know, unfortunately right now, I feel like some of that has to come from like ourselves to be able to create that space for one another. And I think to remind our community, right, that like we deserve that. And I think we do that by also centering the stories of joy and the moments when we can be light and we can laugh about it. Because I think if we're always in this conversation of struggle and of resiliency, we tend to sit in a space where we're just sharing stories of hardship. But I think to also be able to say, like, there's so much that happens, so much beauty that undocumented people, that migrant communities, that Latinx communities have, despite the worst of them all. There's a poet by the name of Yosimar Reyes, who I love, and he has this beautiful relationship with his grandma. And he has this video where he talks about, you know, COVID was a really hard time, but he saw all of these women in his grandma's community, right? She's like in her 90s. And they were all loving and supporting one another, whether it was like, you know, creating shared meals that families who were struggling to be able to put food on the table during COVID were able to have. And he talked about how beautiful those gatherings where people were sharing food were, despite the darkness that people were feeling. And I think to be able to honor that and to celebrate that we are people who show up with a lot of joy, that we do have the ability to celebrate. So I would say, like, we need to create that space for us as individuals in this work. And then we also need to be able to create more spaces of celebration for our community as a whole, where people can feel loved and celebrated despite everything else that may be going on around us.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Our next question is, based on your experience, what are your suggestions as to what would be helpful in assuring that the immigration process is humane and provides a path for documentation?
Yeah, you know, I think a big part of that is creating a broader understanding of what actually takes place in our immigration system. You know, my parents were able to become US citizens, and despite that, I was not able to adjust my status as a DACA recipient. And when I would share that story, people were shocked. But if you're immigrant, that story is so common. You know, a lot of people share that story. And so I think a lot of what happens is that we want to create this system, but there's so many people that, because of fear or because of lack of information, actually have no idea that, like, this line or this system that people are being asked to get, you know, to use for legal immigration isn't one that actually is built for the modern needs of our country, both from a humanity standpoint, but also from a labor and economic standpoint. And so I think we need to be able to create that understanding broadly of what is happening. And I think we need to be able to, as a country, really understand, like, you know, the Roaring Fork Valley, plain and simple, does not run without immigrant labor, does not run without the amazing Latinx people who work front and back of the house on so many different industries. You know, today my dad went to work building houses in Aspen. And I know that, like, he works with many other people. And I think we have to be able to say, we understand that, we see those people. And I think we have a lot of allyship, but we don't have enough people willing to say, look, we need those folks here. And here's that value that they bring to us. And also, you know, their kids go to school with my kids, and they're living a richer experience in their school communities because they have this diversity. And I think being able to have those real conversations about the systemic needs to modernize our immigration system, but also be able to have the conversations about the humanity and the ways in which immigrant communities are, you know, at the very heart of the communities that we live and grow in.
Thank you. Our next question is, the Trump administration attempted to dismantle DACA in 2017. The Supreme Court blocked those efforts in June 2020, but the court did not rule that Trump or any president could not end the program, only that the Trump administration had failed to follow proper procedures in attempting to do so. How do we ensure the safety of this program?
You know, I feel really hopeful given the commitment that the current White House, that the Biden administration has demonstrated towards the program. I think part of what we'll hopefully see soon will be DACA being put through the rulemaking process, which will strengthen the DACA program and will ensure that the program has those structures to survive future court battles. But I think ultimately what DACA recipients and what dreamers across our country deserve is certainty, and that certainty can only be delivered to them by legislation. And I've been saying this for the last few months because I truly believe it, right? We have asked as a country for thousands of DACA recipients to go in every year, to pay a huge fee, and to renew their protections, to get fingerprinted, to go, get background checked. And they have done that. They've done everything we have asked. And at this moment in time, the US Congress has failed them. And, I can't think of a job where you get a job and you fail to meet the expectations of that job and you get hired again. And so we have for a long time sent folks to Congress who have failed to take action on really big issues in our country, and immigration is just one of them. It is time for us to say to those folks, like, look, we have sent you to do a job, and that is to figure out solutions and to move our country forward. And if they can't deliver those solutions, then the American electorate needs to make decisions about what that means. Because DACA recipients and dreamers deserve that certainty. I've had the opportunity, just last week to sit with two incredible dreamers who missed the opportunity to have DACA by months, just because they came here like 3 or 5 months after that date cutoff time. One of them just graduated with a biochemistry degree. The other wants to be early childcare educator. So I'm like, these are exactly the folks who we want to be able to have pathways of opportunity in our country. And the only thing standing in the way is Congress's inability to come up with a permanent solution that they all deserve.
Thank you. Our next question is what needs to take place to get more capable, educated Latina leaders like yourself in these places of power that are so often gate-kept from our community?
I think that's a challenging question because I don't really know. And I can tell you that in the spaces and the rooms in which I have occupied, I have been met with opposition many times, both because like I said, I'm much younger, and because I fight really hard for the values that are right. And oftentimes that is against like what some people in power want. And so I think like what is important for our Latino community and to be able to grow emerging Latino leaders is for us to ensure that networks exist that help them build power. Because it is really hard to be out there on your own trying to change a whole system. So, one of the things I've been really sitting with is what does it look like to build power within our own communities, to be able to say, we're going to send these folks out there, but then we have all of this, like whether it's, we are organizing to keep them there, right? We're organizing to make sure that they aren't silenced, because that type of backing is what we also require when we go into these spaces. Because, so often, and as I've experienced myself, I've had to sit in rooms where I've had to tell people like, you want to silence me because my parents aren't fancy donors. And because you think you can do that to me. And I've had to really stand up for myself in those moments. And that has felt really hard. And at times has almost made me wonder, like, am I going to lose my job because I'm speaking up in this way? Right? Like I used to do it in education too. When I saw a 3rd grade student get put in handcuffs and in the back of a cop car, I was the person who said, I will quit if you do not put a protocol in place to ensure that this never happens again. But that is because I had a responsibility as a woman of color and as a Latina to be able to say, like, I'm not going to let you do this to our kids. And that felt really hard. And I think that has really worn me out. And so that's one of the things I'm really thinking about is how do we build those networks of power so that people can feel a sense of backing when they do have to go out there and put themselves out there and take risks to stand up for what is right.
And are you finding those networks of power as you move through your work? Are you finding that you're seeing more white people, banding together with you to hold those same standards?
Not all the time. I think they exist in like smaller bubbles. And I'm super grateful, right? Like one of my biggest mentors in the political space is another young white woman who deeply believes in supporting other women. And that meeting her has been one of the biggest blessings in my life, because she has really believed in my voice and in my power. And she's helped me understand and navigate that power in a way in which maybe I didn't have the context to, because I hadn't grown up with some of those in some of those spaces. And so I think about her, like if we can have multiple people like that who see young people of color, or like, or people who are just coming from a different background, who don't have natural access to these powers, who say, how do I make sure that the next Marissa, has the ability to like become the next CEO or become the next, school principal? How am I helping making sure that that happens? I think sometimes when we talk about allyship, it just feels really hard and wonky to understand like what it means. And for me, I'm like, it's actually kind of simple, right? Like if you want to be an ally in making sure that we're disrupting systems of power that continue to marginalize the same people, how are you creating opportunities and pathways for more leaders from that community to be able to step into those spaces and help disrupt those systems that are keeping people away from actually being able to thrive?
Thank you. So in our remaining minute or so, what's next for you? Tell us about what you're up to and what's next.
Right now I'm still super excited to continue my work at Forward at the state and at the federal level. One of my biggest mentors at Forward is somebody who keeps saying to me, this is the year. And I am going to end the year thinking that to myself, like, this is the year when we will get something done. And so I am like really committed to continuing that fight and to see it through. I'm also thinking a lot for myself, like I have stepped into these rooms, into these places, and sometimes I feel like I need just a little bit more. And so I've really thought about like what it means for me to pursue a higher degree than what I have, to be able to build like broader networks that allow me to, create bigger change for my community. And so I've been really thinking about pursuing a master's program in the years to come that allows me to do that and to continue to do that work, particularly in the policy space.
That's great. Thank you. Again, it was such an honor to host you here today. Thanks for being with us, Marissa, and we're all inspired by you, and we look forward to staying in touch with you. Thanks, Domenika, for your wonderful contributions and moderating of this program. Thanks to our audience for tuning in today and asking all of the great questions. All of our community events this summer are free, and so if you are in a position to support our work, please click on the link in the chat. I hope you all will join us for our upcoming events. We have a lot of great events this summer, commencing tomorrow with our first in-person event for the summer. You can find a full listing of in-person and virtual events at aspeninstitute.org/Aspen Summer 2021. Thanks for joining us.